From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. One point that Alicia made before the break on this SEC climate disclosure regulation is that it might be vulnerable to a legal challenge. And Kim, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that. In July, the Journal had an op-ed, and it was co-written by a former member of the SEC. And it draws comparisons between the case that the Supreme Court decided this last year on the EPA's Clean Power Plan. And what the Supreme Court said there was that Congress never gave the EPA explicitly this power. And this is a major question for Congress to resolve. And so the EPA can't do it on its own. And do you think there's a comparison there with this SEC regulation that the argument would be Congress never gave the SEC the authority to mandate that a retailer figure out its emissions up and down the supply chain?
Yeah, one of the things that op-ed really made clear, at least for me, and I'm got to wager other readers, is just how powerful and potentially consequential that West Virginia v. EPA decision is. Because the op-ed made the claim that the power grab that the EPA engaged in that particular situation with the Clean Power Plan is nearly indistinguishable from what the SEC is now attempting to do here on these disclosure rules. And it also made clear that the Supreme Court, in writing that decision, had clearly been on to all of the tricks that had increasingly been going on out in industry and in government with bureaucrats to essentially sidestep Congress. And it basically laid out a number of things that were red lines or problems that would allow the court to just say that something was a major question and therefore needed to be dealt with by Congress rather than allowing bureaucrats to do it instead. So, one of it was as housesweeping as it doesn't impose big changes across the economy. Clearly, the SEC rule does that here. One is, does it lie beyond the expertise of the agency in question? There is little doubt that the SEC has no real experience in climate issues. Does it rely on some novel or new interpretation of long-standing statutes? That is what the SEC is doing here, looking back to 1930s laws, the Securities Act and the Securities Exchange Act as the basis for its power. And this is the part that always makes me smile, did Congress actually consider this and then decide not that it wasn't going to do it? And obviously that is the case here. So I think it made a very powerful case for why this SEC rule would be very vulnerable. But what I loved about this whole comparison is how it made clear that a lot of the regulations that the current administration are dreaming up are potentially something that could get targeted by this major questions doctrine in the court.
So, Alicia, we'll give you the last word on this topic. You've been covering this ESG stuff for a long while. I mean, how significant do you think that this backlash is turning out to be? And there's a recent letter from 19 state attorneys general to the asset manager BlackRock. And one line of it is they say, based on the facts currently available to us, BlackRock appears to use the hard-earned money of our state citizens to circumvent the best possible return on investment as well as their vote, unquote. And a letter like that from 19 attorneys general seems to me like a pretty big deal. I don't know about you.
Right. So I think the issue here, or where they really have power, is in terms of investigation and potentially filing lawsuits against the asset managers such as BlackRock, but also Vanguard, for potentially abusing, antitrust or laws or violating antitrust laws in terms of essentially colluding across the economy to impose these requirements that we mentioned earlier on companies. I'm a little skeptical that the politicians or the AGs themselves can actually create any change in terms of the financial incentives or are actually going to lead to an exodus from these funds. They manage trillions and trillions. BlackRock has over $10 trillion in assets under its management. It does produce pretty good, solid returns for its customers. More broadly speaking, it's really the pension funds, the government worker pension funds, not the AGs, and even in most cases, not even the state treasurers who control the money. And the state pension funds and local pension funds are actually very in bed with the progressives here. And they've really actually been, especially out in California, CalSTRS, but also CalPERS, have been really pushing this ESG investing and been aligned with BlackRock and the other asset managers on this. So the money, I'm not sure that there's going to be a huge backlash in terms of money shifting out of these funds. I mean, we'll see. But I'm more optimistic that the state attorneys generals could, and potentially if a Republican wins the White House in 2024, you may see some movement on that front in the FTC or even the other executive agencies trying to really crack down on asset managers that are violating their fiduciary duty to their customers.
Finally, the big election news on Tuesday was, as expected, in Wyoming, Harriet Hageman has won the primary there for the House race, 66%. She'll be the Republican nominee in November and very likely the next congresswoman from Wyoming. Liz Cheney coming in at about 29%, so less than half of the vote of her competitor there. Let's listen to a clip of Harriet Hageman on election night.
She's not focusing on Wyoming. She's not focusing on our issues. She's still focusing on an obsession about President Trump. And the citizens of Wyoming, the voters of Wyoming, sent a very loud message tonight. We have spoken, and that is not what we are interested in terms of our lone congressional representative. Wyoming is entitled to have a representative that represents our interests, that listens to us, that addresses our issues. That isn't Liz Cheney, and the fact that that's where she went back to with her speech tonight, I think demonstrates that she really isn't listening to Wyoming now. She hasn't for quite some time, and that's why we needed to replace her.
And here's a piece of that speech from Liz Cheney conceding.
2 years ago, I won this primary with 73% of the vote. I could easily have done the same again. The path was clear. But it would have required that I go along with President Trump's lie about the 2020 election. It would have required that I enable his ongoing efforts to unravel our democratic system and attack the foundations of our republic. That was a path I could not and would not take.
Kim, what do you make of this? I mean, I guess my thought is that she's right, that she could have easily won that primary had she minded her Trumpian P's and Q's, I suppose. So maybe the pessimistic view is that these stolen election claims have such a grip on the party. The optimistic view might be that Liz Cheney and the January 6th committee also did other things to alienate Republican voters. The January 6th committee, remember, just to pick one thing, has leaked text messages from Ginny Thomas, the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, which has very little, to my eye, to do with anything related to the investigation or the riot on January 6th. And so maybe there's a little bit of truth in both of those stories.
Yeah, I don't put it as starkly as Liz Cheney would put it there. I think that Liz Cheney could have won her renomination without buying into crazy election claims. There are a lot of Republicans out there who have done that. You know, look at Glenn Youngkin. He is currently the head of Virginia, the new governor. And there's also been plenty of primaries where you don't necessarily have candidates that have been all in on, you know, the wildest of election claims, and they managed to succeed. The issue here for Cheney, I think, was in part what Hageman did describe. I think there were a lot of Wyoming residents who they do only have one representative there, and they really want that person to be focused on their issues, which includes some of the biggest fights going on right now over energy production, etc. Liz Cheney made a decision very early on that she was going to stake everything on this question of the January 6th committee, try to make this a referendum on the issue, and that ended up failing. And, you know, the fact that this was clear, she has already filed to transfer some of her campaign funds into a new political super PAC, which she's going to call, at least for now, the Great Task. And that great task, as she defined it in her speech, was doing whatever necessary to make sure Donald Trump isn't reelected president. And that is absolutely entirely her right. But I think this was a question of Wyoming deciding whether or not they wanted a congressperson that was going to be solely focused on that over the next 2 years or on Wyoming issues.
The other notable thing that Cheney said is she said in that concession speech, now the real work begins. And she also confirmed recently that she is actually thinking about running for president in 2024. And it raises an interesting question whether this split could cost the Republican Party in 2024, maybe the presidential election. And I don't expect, Alicia, that anything, those kind of considerations would dissuade President Trump from running. But do you think that if Liz Cheney makes clear that she would run against him as an independent candidate, try to siphon enough votes to stop him from getting a second term in the White House, that might sway some Republican voters in the Republican primary?
Well, I think it would be largely a kamikaze mission here. I mean, potentially she could could siphon off some votes, though the people who are more inclined to vote for her may also not be inclined to vote for Trump regardless and be more inclined to vote for a Democrat or vote at all. There's also the last time a third-party candidate actually gained a lot of ground was in 1992, Ross Perot, and he arguably did cost George Bush the election. If Cheney were to run and mount a bid in 2024, I think that it would be self-defeating to herself. It would be self-defeating to the Republican Party and the country, because there is the potential that she would hand the election to Democrats or a Democratic candidate in 2024 who would just continue to impose the kinds of policies Biden has been. And if Biden will run again, he's now sending indications that he plans to. But someone who may replace him, Kamala Harris, potential Elizabeth Warren, others who want the job, would likely be even more progressive. So I think she needs to think hard about whether it is she really wants to essentially blow up the Republican Party, divide the country more, and do essentially what Donald Trump did with the Georgia elections 2 years ago, essentially in sabotaging Republicans and handing an election to the Democrats.
A couple of last thoughts here on the results from Alaska, and let's start with the ranked choice voting for the U.S. House seat. And there the results are interesting and pretty close. So right now, the Democrat is in first with about 38%. That's Mary Peltola. And then the two Republican candidates. And remember how this works. The ranked choice voting system works. If nobody gets over 50%, the lowest candidate is eliminated, and then all of those voters are reshuffled to their second or third choice. And what's interesting here is that the candidate currently in second is Sarah Palin with 32% of the vote, and then third is Nick Begich with about 29% of the vote. And it goes to show the issues with ranked choice voting. I should say that there's only about 70% of the vote reported. There's still a lot coming in, so those rankings could change. But it goes to show the strategic problems that ranked choice voting, I think, raise. Because if you assume that a lot of those Democrats would prefer not to be represented by Sarah Palin, then if Nick Begich gets eliminated first here, then maybe they would have been better off, Kim, if they had not voted for the Democratic candidate. Because if he's the first one eliminated, then their second chance votes don't get a chance to be reallocated to him.
Yeah, this was something that the Republican side were also very concerned about. Because think about this, there was always a very strong possibility that the Democrat would come in first because you had two Republicans that were going to split the vote in what is a pretty Republican state. And so it was fascinating. The Republican Party of Alaska spent some real money and time trying to educate Republican voters. So they had a slogan. They said, rank the red, meaning you were going to walk into the ballot box and you were going to see two Republicans. They were very concerned that some Alaskans, especially Republican Alaskans, were so angry over this ranked voting system that they would only put down the one person they wanted to win and not go through the rest of the ranking process. And so the GOP was trying to explain to people, don't do that because there's a potential that after the first round, a Republican can get eliminated. And therefore, it's very important that you have ranked the other Republicans so that they come in on top over the Democrat. I mean, the whole thing is such a kind of strategic nightmare for voters. And there were a lot of reports of Alaskans being very bitter about this whole process, not to mention the fact that they've now got this long system where no one is even going to find out the results there until September. So a lot could still change. And then remember, this is simply the final vote for a special election to fill out the rest of Don Young's seat for a few months. Alaskans get to go do this whole ranked choice voting system again in November with the results of the primaries for all the other seats and for the full term of Don Young.
The other sort of odd result that strikes me is in the U.S. Senate race, and there the top vote getter in the primary is Senator Lisa Murkowski with about 44% of the vote, and Republican challenger with about 40% of the vote. And in the primary, there were all sorts of minor candidates, but nobody above single digits. And remember how Alaska's system now works. The top four vote getters in the primary move on to the general election. And so it seems odd to me, why would anybody bother voting in the primary if they're going to just rerun the election with these same two major Republican candidates in November?
Yeah, it's kind of nuts, especially because you're basically going to rerun it with those top two candidates with the added complexity of a ranked choice system in which who knows how voters will allocate in their second or third or fourth choices those single digit candidates that came in. And, as we were mentioning yesterday on the podcast, this just kind of goes to show the silliness of this ranked choice system and some of the real flaws of it. I think what these results show, because this was a real race between Lisa Murkowski, the incumbent, and Kelly Tshibaka, who's challenging her. And, they both end up with more than 40% of the vote. They're very, very narrowly divided. If this had been a straight up Republican primary, Murkowski might be facing some accountability from Republican voters who are unhappy with her. These results clearly show Murkowski benefiting from a lot of Democrats who came to vote for her in the election. And then there'll be all manner of gaming out how that works come the November election with this new ranked choice system. Some interesting reports recently, by the way, too, that while she didn't publicly comment on this, as Alaskans were going through their initiative battle over whether or not to change the voting system, some Murkowski people were caught on record saying that it certainly benefited her. And that, I think, is also fed into some Alaskan sort of skepticism about why they are being put through this process.
Thank you, Kim and Alicia. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.